Hello? All right, awesome, it's working. Good morning, everybody. Hello and welcome to the 2023 TWC Workforce Forum. You are currently in the Jobs in the Oil Patch, a New Dawning session. My name is Hope Hemingway, and I'm gonna serve as your moderator today. I'm just gonna be monitoring the room, handling any issues that arise. Forum materials are gonna be available on the TWC website. I ask that you please silence all electronic devices, and if you do have any calls, please take them in the hallway. If time permits, at the conclusion of the presentation, there will be a Q&A period. Please raise your hand, and I will bring this microphone to you, as we are recording the session and want to make sure all questions are clearly understood. If we do not have time to answer your questions, you may request the presenter's contact information at the end of this session. You will receive an electronic survey after the event. Please complete, as your feedback is greatly appreciated. If the session is approved for CRC CEU credit, which this one I believe is, please go to the CRC CEU table in the pre-function area. With that, actually, I have two more things that are important to mention. Number one, parking. So I had a few people ask questions about parking. I have been informed that as far as parking in the garage goes, it is $5 for the morning and $5 for the afternoon. So for today, it would be $10 total. We do know that the line to get out of the garage, as you guys probably noticed yesterday afternoon, was very long. So the hotel has asked us to please have your tickets, take them to the front desk, and they will validate them, and you can pay for the parking at the front desk. They're thinking that that will help, minimize the amount of time spent waiting to exit the garage later this afternoon. So whenever you get a chance, make sure that you do that. And one last note, as far as checking out of the hotel goes, there is no late checkout. So I was asked to remind you, please check out of the hotel before noon. So it's recommended that you do that during our morning break time. With that, we invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy today's presentation. Please welcome your speaker and panelists for this session. You guys now have the floor.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Gabriel Guzman, manager of the Economic Analysis Unit with the Texas Workforce Commission's Labor Market Information Department. I've been working with TWC since 2000, so just a little over 22 years. And my partner here, William Lutz, is also with TWC, and I will let him introduce himself.
Hello. Hello, my name is William Lutz. I've been at TWC now for a little over 10 years and am an economist in the Labor Market Information Department. As all of you probably know in this room, we're the keepers of the state's labor market statistics, and we try to help people understand the world they live in and the economy better.
Thank you, Will. Okay, and I will start the presentation. I'll do the first half. I'll be talking about a general overview of the labor market in Texas, and then how the price of oil relates to oil and gas employment. So just some high-level overview bullet points. And I apologize for this. We just released the March data about 2 Fridays ago. So what I will say is actually updated data. What you will see is the previous month. So the unemployment rate remained at 4% or below for the past 13 months. So back since March 2022, it has been at 4% or below. That represents basically what we call the natural rate of unemployment, or considered full employment, basically just representing structural, the job market, people finding jobs in and out. So overall, pretty low unemployment rate. The number of unemployed actually did go up over the month in March. It's just under 600,000. It increased by 12,700. However, it's been down. It was decreased about 30,100 over the year. So the number of employed, though, increased about 5 times that amount over the month by 66,200. So unemployment rate went up slightly, employed went up much more. So the Texas also has set 18th consecutive months in a row of new highs in employment. These are total non-farm jobs, about 13.8 million. And initial and continued claims remain low. So the continued claims for March was actually just under the February 2020 level. That's right before the pandemic hit, by about 12,000. So the initial claims, which are those that people who have been laid off, they can apply to TWC for unemployment benefits, was only about 1,500 claims above the February 2020 level. So overall, still on par with right before COVID. As I said earlier, the unemployment rate is at or below 4%. It actually was unchanged over the month. It is about half a percentage point higher than the U.S., which stands at 3.5%. The U.S. decreased a tenth of a point over the month. We did reach another milestone in terms of labor force, that is civilians, people, Texas residents 16 and over who are employed or actively looking for work. So we reached a new high there, about just under 14.9 million, as we added 78,800 persons. And this represented the third consecutive increase, a monthly increase, and the 31st increase over the last 35 years, so almost a full 3-year stretch there. The lowest unemployment rate in series history, just for context, it was 3.4% over May and June 2019, so right before the pandemic. We're not very far from that at 4%. So currently, this represents the March rate of 4%, the 7th lowest reading in series history, which goes back to January 1976. So overall, still low unemployment. Switching to jobs, the total non-farm jobs, Texas added about 28,600 jobs over the month. And as I said earlier, this set a 18th consecutive high, about 13,839,200 jobs. Over the year, we gained about 575,100, which equated to a robust growth rate of 4.3%. So 4.3% expansion since March 2022. The private sector basically is the total non-farm minus government public employees, grew even quicker at 4.6% over the year. And also, lastly, I want to say that every major industry, mining and logging, construction, manufacturing, leisure and hospitality, all of those major industries has gained positive annual growth for the past 22 consecutive months. So just under 2 years, expanding employment-wise. This is a closer look at major industries' employment over the month. Those on the left are the industries that lost jobs, and those to the right are the ones that actually gained. Overall, 8 major industries increased on a monthly basis. They were led by leisure and hospitality, which added 7,400 jobs, brought on mainly by gains in accommodations, food services, restaurants, hotels, things like that. Added about 6,000 jobs over the month. Construction added about 5,800 jobs, representing the 4th consecutive increase in that industry. Government as well added about 5,700 jobs, mostly driven by local government, an increase of 4,400 positions. And then there was a tie in the 4th place of trade, transportation, and utilities, which includes retail trade, wholesale trade, things like that, as well as utilities. Added about 5,400, and then private education and health services, which would be the private schools, things like Baylor, private universities, and primary schools, added also 5,400. So a tie at those particular ones. The private health and education services was mainly driven by healthcare and social assistance, with 3,700 jobs added. This graph looks at JOLTS, which stands for Job Openings and Layoff Turnover Survey. This is from BLS. So this is for Texas data. It measures, the survey measures job openings, total separations, including layoffs and fires, things like that, and then of course hires. So on this chart we have job openings in blue and then hires in black. So the main takeaway from this is job openings still remain elevated. I don't know if you all heard from the beginning, the chair had spoke on this, chair of TWC, that we still have a very high level of job openings. So for the first time, we had breached the 635,000 job level back in February of 2021, and we still remain elevated above that. So in February, because this one is actually a month behind our regular unemployment and jobs count survey. So in February, we had 592,000 hires across the state. and 888,000 job openings to be exact in February. So that was actually 2 months removed from the overall series high job openings for Texas at 1.033 million jobs. And that was back in December 2022. Over the past year, about 5 times within the past year, we've breached that 1 million job openings mark. So overall, lots of opportunity in the state of Texas. So hires were up slightly over the month by 0.5%, while job openings were down by 5.9% over the month. So a little bit of a convergence there, job openings and hires getting closer together. In fact, the gap narrowed by 58,000 over the month and rests at just under 300,000. So overall, about 300,000 more job openings and hires. So employers still, trying to get people to fill their positions. If we look at the hires to job openings ratio, it stands at 0.7. That basically means how hires are with respect to job openings. And so for 27 consecutive months, we've had a ratio of less than 1. So anything less than 1 meaning that there's more job openings than hires. Just another way to look at the data. Next, I'd like to focus on unemployment and the price of oil, how it affects industries, mining and logging, and stuff that's tangent to those particular industries. So if we look at this is mining and logging employment. This comes from our CS survey. This is directly related to oil and gas, the oil and gas extraction, as well as support activities for oil and gas, things like oil and gas exploration, pooling tubes, casings, things like that to help with that industry. As you can see, it's a little bit more volatile than mining and logging. We see 3 peaks and valleys there. If you go back a few slides and remember the total non-farm that we had overall a large increase, and then COVID happened, and then a subsequent increase afterwards. So mining and logging had 3 peaks, and well, I should say there was actually 2 since 2005 until non-farm. We had the Great Recession as well. So the first peak and valley, the first valley happened there. That was during the Great Recession. So definitely a decrease in demand and caused a decrease in prices and therefore employment to fall back as well. That large increase in the middle there had to do with the advent of fracking, oil and gas, and basically gave oil companies a cheaper, not a cheaper, but a lower break-even point. Therefore, it increased the supply of oil and gas, and then the drop-off there actually the result of a glut of oil supply in the market. So that decreased the price, and therefore the employment dropped as well. The last one there is COVID. Of course, as you all know, shutdowns affected the economy. That affected also the demand for oil. Right before that, actually, there was oil and gas was already hurting from the Saudi Arabia and Russia price war there, which decreased the price of oil there. So before COVID, that happened, and then COVID happened, and so that decreased employment even more. So 2 events overall, affected mining or oil and gas as of late. So this doesn't go back to 2005, but it just kind of wanted to show the rig counts versus the West Texas Intermediate, pricing. So right before COVID, the 2 lines are fairly close to each other. The number of rigs, and then of course the oil, the price of gas. After COVID, there's a little bit of separation there, as you can tell by that line. So in March 2023, the West Texas Intermediate spot price averaged $73.28. So it decreased $3.55 over the month, and about $35.22 over the year. Texas added about 51 rigs over the year, but lost 2 over the month. So a decrease into 370 rigs as it stands now. So overall, as you can see, like a near peak, West Texas Intermediate has been declining a little bit, likely due to higher supply and local low demand as uncertainty, the Russia-Ukrainian war happening, as well as China's trying to bounce back in the economy from the COVID issue. So as long as oil and gas is above 70, it seems like Texas $70 a barrel. It seems like Texas producers are fairly happy and have kept rig counts fairly stable. But the separation there could happen for many reasons. Having trouble finding workers during COVID, the uncertainty of COVID. Definitely, some investors in oil and gas were skittish about what demand would look like, as well as we'll see later in these other slides, productivity increases. So relying less on labor, more of a capital improvements in technology, and more reliance on capital versus labor. So overall, like in the next few slides, we'll talk about the stair-step effect. The oil prices increase, and then mining and logging tends to lag that. Afterwards, you'll see a pattern there. Lags by about a few months, as we'll show, and it's somewhat related to break-even price. So these are the past 8 years, just to kind of look. Past 8 events where we're looking at the annual growth of the price of West Texas Intermediate and the overall subsequent decrease in the employment. Overall, if you'll kind of study that, it's more or less about at least a 6-month lag, and then employment will follow the decrease in the price of oil. This is just a graphical representation of that. Pay attention to the valleys there. The West Texas Intermediate, the blue line there, especially those decreases you'll see where they bottom out. And then, as I said earlier, about 6 months later or more, the red line, the over the year employment will follow a trend. So it's basically a lagging indicator following directly related to the price of oil. So this is for mining and logging, extraction, as well as support activities for oil and gas. Next, we're going to look at some related industries, just to kind of show more of the other, I want to say downstream industries, midstream, downstream meaning refining, things like that, midstream, the transportation of oil and gas. Not every area in Texas is, actually pulls oil and gas from the ground. Some other areas along the Gulf Coast actually, are more involved in petrochemical and things like that, export. So petrochemical and petroleum and coal products manufacturing, which means the refining, gasoline, things like that. Not as volatile, but somewhat similar to the extraction industry. You see a large increase there in the beginning, and then of course the decrease having to do later on, I think maybe more so with price increases, inflation. Overall, if you pay attention to the scale, it's not too much of a change. It's about 3,000 employment difference. It's over 20,000 overall. So just a small, about 15% fluctuation there, not as much as extraction. Pipeline transportation, overall fairly stable, moving up, not as labor intensive as the other industries. So just to kind of highlight again the effect of price of oil and gas on these industries, pipeline not so much. If we look at basic chemical manufacturing, that's petrochemical, gasoline, things like that, lubricating oils. There's a little bit of fluctuation there too, specifically in the July 2010, and then more recently 2021. So not as much as the extraction, but definitely does follow some of especially the two sharpest values, with the extraction industry. Next, I want to talk about exports. The reason being oil and gas, not necessarily a large chunk of the overall labor market in terms of percentage-wise, but the value of oil and gas, exceeds, more than just employment, but also overall in terms of money brought to the economy, in terms of revenue and jobs created. So Texas net exports were $4.9 billion in February. There's the blue line there. It was down $3.7 billion from a year ago. But it's fallen 22 consecutive months of continuous annual growth or increase. So we basically, what you're looking at there is a trade surplus. We export more than we import. So Texas has enjoyed a surplus for 53 months now since October 2018. So definitely, riding high on that part. The U.S. On the other end of the spectrum actually has had experienced a trade deficit since 1970. So the U.S. as a whole importing more than exporting. So this is looking at the Texas gross state product in terms of exports. So gross state products is basically all the goods and services produced in the state of Texas is in terms of value. So in 2022, about just under $500 billion of exports made up about a fifth of Texas's gross state product. As you can see, that last line, the last bar on that chart, with a series high of 2.3% increase in 2021. So a large increase in 2021 following 2020. Of course, that's the comeback from COVID there. So in pre-COVID, in 2019, the state had 328 billion of exports. So 500 versus 328. So we've increased a lot there, and the percentage of the gross state product has increased as well. So within the past 5 years, the only decline in the share of gross state product actually happened in 2020 because of COVID. So what makes up Texas's large export industry, or the fact that we have such a surplus? As you can see, the top four are related to oil and gas. So the number one, oil and gas at the top, is a percentage of overall exports, represented just about a third, actually 32.7, so less than a third, but right about there of oil and gas, crude oil and petroleum exports. So from 2021 to 2022, oil and gas shares, exported commodity, grew by 4.2 percentage points over the year. So the next three fall in oil and gas, petroleum and core products, manufacturing. That'd be that would be gasoline, lubricating oils. So that was the number one export in the country, Texas, since January 2002. And overall, Texas made just over half the exports of this particular product in the U.S. Basic chemical manufacturing also related to oil and gas, petrochemical, and then resins, synthetics, artificial and synthetic fiberglass. That's things like plastics, things like that. Of course, as you know, related to oil and gas being in the top four export for Texas. A look at the dollar value. Of course, oil and gas represents a large portion of that, and a large increase, as you can tell, from 2019 to 2022. Oil and gas raked in nearly $160 billion of exports for the state. So it's more than doubling the 2019 level there. So all these industries bring in lots of revenue for the state. What's the reason for showing this? Not every region, like I said earlier, in Texas is like strictly or directly related to extraction. A lot of areas, like in the Gulf Coast, have petrochemical. Corpus Christi, Houston, Beaumont, Victoria. A lot of their economies, regional economies, are centered on that, as well as ship terminals of things like that nature, tankers. So overall, still being a very powerful industry in Texas. Maybe not employment-wise, but its impact can be felt in many ways. As alluded to earlier, the employment was actually in mining and logging was the only industry that hasn't actually caught up pre-COVID. It still lags, the other major industries. So we looked into this, and part of that reason may be because the productivity has increased so much, has improved. So oil and gas companies are still out there producing, their product, and productivity has increased a lot. As you can see, the yellow and blue line there was actually a productivity spike there. It's measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's a measure of this productivity of how companies use inputs to achieve their output gain in outputs and services. So as you can tell there's a large increase, and then overall a sharp decrease in actual employment. So that tells us that they're relying more on capital and less on labor. If we look at the support activities for mining, overall not as much, not as drastic as the oil and gas extraction part. Overall fairly closely related employment to productivity there, so not the gains that you saw in the oil and gas extraction industry. Another thing we kind of wanted to check up on was just to kind of see if that was related to production as the productivity has been going up. Overall, workplace injuries are down. As you can see, the graph on the left, the Texas crude production versus natural gas withdrawals is up. So we have production up following that increase in productivity, but overall claims as far as workplace injuries are actually down from 2014, from 3,600 down to about 1,300. And then, of course, the fatalities, the non-fatal injuries for workers are down also as well. So that kind of also gives credence to what we're seeing, more capital-intensive production, less reliance on labor, claims down, injuries down, production up overall. So we may not see employment represented how it was pre-COVID, as the industry has made some improvements. So. Okay. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague here, William Lutz, who will present on regional data.
Good morning. I know it's early in the morning. Do everyone want to stand up a little bit? If you want to, you can. Okay, I guess you won't, so we'll just keep going. I just figured I would try to keep everybody going at this point in the morning. I'm going to talk about two things. I'm going to talk about regional data and what does this mean for the regions where the oil and gas and energy are really critical to the economy. And we're going to talk a little bit about where to find the jobs data and try to do a little bit of forward looking here. You know, what does the future mean for this industry? And so before I go any further, I want to just emphasize something from the last two slides because it's going to come up as we go forward, which is part of where we came from. Is one of the questions that's out there is, are we going to get back in terms of oil and gas extraction employment to where we were 3 or 4 years ago? And that is very much a subject of debate. Some of the people at TWC, when they talk to folks in industry, hear that we've been able to automate some of the most dangerous parts of oil and gas extraction. And as a result, we're able to take more oil out of the ground with the same or fewer workers than we had before. And so that's kind of the point those two slides were making there, is that productivity is output per worker hour. That's how it's defined. And so you notice it shoots up the last 10 years. It shoots up really sharply. But your workplace injuries have gone down. And so the question is historically, and we're going to talk a lot more about this historical trend, historically, oil and gas extraction employment and related employment tends to fluctuate at a lag, as Mike mentioned earlier, with the price of oil. Is that going to hold going forward? That is, I think, a key question relating to oil and gas that is definitely one worth taking a look at. But first, let's take a little bit of a look at regional data. Now, one of the things I comment that my job is a whole lot easier in Texas because the numbers always are pretty good statewide. I mean, they have variations depending on where you are, but I get to run around and not put the dismal in dismal science. I get to often deliver good news rather than bad news, which is a whole lot easier than if I were in some other parts of the economy that are still recovering from what we dealt with a few years ago. None of our metropolitan statistical areas declined in their civilian labor force over the year. And I think part of that is that there are so many jobs being created here that it entices people to get back into the labor force. Because one of the things you saw in 2020 is the labor force went way down. Some of that was people, once they got laid off, were like, I don't think I'm going to find anything right now, or it just isn't the right time. And as the economy improved, people came back in and decided that work is something they wanted again. Our fastest growing MSAs over the year were Midland and Odessa. The only caveat I would throw into that is during that downturn, they got hit really hard. So they had more ground to make up than some of these other metro areas did. And part of that was that there was kind of a double hit to those economies. The first is what every place in the nation and the world dealt with COVID. The other part of that was oil prices went down, and that even started before the pandemic. And so that's part of why they're making up for a little bit of lost ground. Dallas, Fort Worth, Arlington, and Austin Round Rock are the topic of national discussion in terms of the growth in jobs and civilian labor force. College Station Bryan was kind of rounds out the top 5. Remember, 3.9% of the labor force in Dallas, that's a large number of people. So just be aware, it's harder to move that needle in your larger areas just because of, so when you really think about the number of jobs that have to be created to get that kind of civilian labor force and employment growth in Dallas and in Austin, it's really pretty impressive because pre-COVID, with the CES employment, we tended to do just a little above 2%, and that was better than most of the nation. Now, granted, the economy is still kind of getting a little bit back to normal. I mean, in Texas, we're in expansion mode, so there's still a little bit of the economy getting back to where it normally is. But I still think when you think about the number of jobs that have been growing in Texas, just looking at the big picture, it's a lot of jobs. We put together a bubble chart we use in our presentations a lot, and what this bubble chart compares is the change over the year with the change over the month. So we look at shorter term, longer term, and you notice that Midland and Odessa are often a little corner of this map, which means they have done very, very well over the year, but in the most recent month, they have not grown quite as fast. So that is, I think, a noteworthy point, which is, in 2020, the employment was really suffered. And as things got back to normal and as oil prices started going up, they came back at a very fast clip. And the question is, what will 2023 look like in those areas? I think that's still an open question. 3 of our MSAs have not gotten back to where they were in 2020. I mean, in February of 2020, which is kind of our baseline for recent events, all of them are fairly close, less than 1% to make up, less than 3% to make up. Texarkana, Odessa, and Beaumont Port Arthur. Notice that 2 of those 3 areas have a lot of petrochemical employment in them. Those are the only 3 areas in Texas that have not gotten beyond February 2020 employment. So most of our MSAs are now not in recovery mode, they're in expansion mode.
Excuse me, can you go back
2 slides? This one?
What's going on in College Station Bryan?
That is an interesting question because you see basically 3% growth over the year and 3% growth over the month. So you have both short-term and long-term civilian labor force growth. Mike, do you have any thoughts on that, looking over that?
No, other than, it continues to have low unemployment, definitely expanding. It might be related to, development in Texas A&M. I know a lot of times you have a big, workforce supplier like that, tends to help with economic development.
And one of the things, education did suffer during COVID and is coming back. But education and government tend to move a little more slowly than some of your, and this is obviously an overgeneralization, some of your private sector, would you say? So it is an interesting outlier in this chart and is one that I'm going to be, for reasons unconnected with this conference over the next couple months, I'm going to take a much closer look at. And definitely, if you want to reach back out in August, I may have a more full answer to that question. Because we're going to be doing some things in College Station, or we're planning on it, hopefully, later this summer. So getting back now, one of the questions that I think is helpful to look at is, where are the jobs in the oil and gas industry? And you see my pie chart, you can obviously see it is not a random distribution. It is not, is it independently and identically distributed, I think is the term statisticians love, IID for those of you who've taken those kinds of coursework. You see that oil mining, quarrying, and oil and gas extraction, obviously you have Houston, Midland at the top. That shouldn't surprise anybody. Dallas, Fort Worth, Arlington kind of surprised me a little as to how high it was. My understanding is a lot. Now remember, the Dallas, Fort Worth, Arlington metropolitan area includes the surrounding counties. So there are a lot of counties in that metro area. All the counties that surround Dallas and Tarrant are in the Dallas, Fort Worth, Arlington metro area. And so some of the Barnett Shale counties, I believe, are in there. Odessa, obviously, we would expect. But you see that obviously the impact this industry has varies significantly based on where you are. And then one of the other things I did is I took petrochemical, coal, and coal products manufacturing jobs, which is a 4-digit industry code that includes refineries, because that's another big piece. It's not just pulling this stuff out of the ground, it's what you do with it after you pull it out of the ground. And what you notice in this chart is that Houston and Beaumont equal 59% of this NAICS code. You add in Corpus Christi, you get to 71. So 3 of our metro areas have 71% of the industry that includes refining. And I think that's very noteworthy for a variety of reasons. One of the other things we look at is concentration. So what is the percent for mining, logging, construction? And with the current employment statistics program, the industries are a little more general because it's a monthly survey, but it is a time series, so we can get a lot more recent data out of it than some of our other data programs. But it lumps mining, logging, and construction into the same industry code. And you notice that mining, logging, and construction is over a third of Midland's economy. It's 23% in Odessa, 13% in Longview, 12% in Beaumont, 10% of Corpus Christi, and 10% of Victoria. And then we put the number of jobs on the slide. So you can tell, in Houston, it's still 8.8%. You know, the Houston economy has diversified quite substantially in the last 30 years or so, but this is still a major player for Houston. So I think this gives you an idea of the metro areas in Texas where this is a huge part of the local economic picture. I mean, obviously everybody thinks of the Permian Basin, but there are other parts of the state where this industry is very important. Well, it's very important everywhere, but especially in these areas. One of the things to notice is that the wages in a lot of our MSAs that have high concentration of oil and gas employment are among the highest in the state. I mean, Midland's at the top, or very, very close to the top, followed by, we decided to use the metropolitan divisions in Dallas and Fort Worth because there's a different wage structure a little bit. But notice that a lot of the areas that have heavy oil and gas employment have wages on average that exceed the state average. So Midland, Houston, Victoria, Corpus Christi all have your average wage exceeding the state average. Obviously you see Austin and Dallas, which are not quite as concentrated in this industry, also have very high wages. They also have high cost of living. So you get into those kinds of trade-offs. Now, one of the things I like to talk about, I'm going to grab the microphone. Where's the static mic here? Oh, they took it. I can use this one. Okay, can you all hear me? One of the things I've noticed is there's a relationship in some areas that have heavy oil and gas employment between the price of oil and the difference in unemployment rates between the state rate and that locality's rate. Now, why do I take the difference in unemployment rates? Because one of the biggest factors that plays in unemployment is what's going on in the national world economy. So by subtracting off the state rate, it helps me isolate the local rate a little better. So this is Houston, and what I've done is the blue line, I have graphed West Texas Intermediate crude price, and the red line, I have graphed that unemployment rate difference. And so you see here that during the Great Recession, your oil prices were actually reasonably high up until right before the Great Recession, And you see this red line is actually pretty low. It's approaching zero, or gets below it actually in some areas. Then the price crashes a little bit, and you start seeing this line go up, the red line go up a little bit. And then as the price gets high, this difference goes down. So you see that there is a relationship. It is not a perfect relationship. Actually, the correlation coefficient is in the mid-0.4s, which for this kind of aggregate economic data tells you there's a relationship, but it's not a perfect correlation. You're never going to get that with this kind of economic data. But what you've noticed here is that usually when your price of oil is high, the red line gets low. When the price of oil is low, the red line gets high. So you have higher unemployment relative to the rest of the state. So you notice that you had relatively high prices between about 11 and about 15, and you see the red line pretty low. Then the price comes down, and in 16, 17, 18, and that red line gets high. And then COVID happens. Now, one of the things you can notice is that the last few months of this graph, they're both going down. So normally you have an inverse correlation here where price is high, the difference in employment, they kind of move in opposite directions. Here they're in 22, they've basically been moving in the same direction. So that's why I started off my remarks with, what does the future hold? Now, some of that, I think, is that you had one of the biggest economic events since World War II that has occurred. And I think that probably played a role in what is going on here. However, I also think that it is an open question what the future looks like in the industry. And I think the fact that you have those two lines moving more or less in the same direction could be a short-term reaction to world events, or could be something longer term. It's hard to say. So I also took the same graph for Midland, and in some ways you can see you could see a relationship. It differs slightly from what we saw in Houston, but it's still a reasonably powerful relationship between the price of oil and the difference between the Midland rate. The magnitude's different. But the difference between the unemployment rate in Midland and its state counterpart. So that relationship, I think, is noteworthy. I also have presented in Corpus Christi, and the relationship in Corpus Christi is also very powerful. One of the things that surprised me, though, is that relationship, that graph will not look as obvious if you do Beaumont-Port Arthur. And I'm not sure why. Because I would have thought like Corpus Christi and Beaumont had some similarities. I mean, they both are coastal communities. They both have a lot of refining. This relationship holds very powerfully in Corpus Christi, less so in Beaumont-Port Arthur, and that's something I'm looking into and trying to come up with a good explanation. I'm not going to give you a bad explanation, so I'll just throw that out there. And for those of you who are familiar with those areas, certainly be interested in any ideas you have of some data that we could look at. So And part of why I started with Houston is, even with as much as the Houston economy has diversified, and it has dramatically, the price of oil still plays a very significant role in the unemployment rate in Houston. And so I think that's something to keep in mind, and it's true for a lot of other areas where oil and gas and energy are major players. Now let me talk a little bit about where you can find some of this data, because obviously in a 1-hour presentation, there's a lot we could have, as we were putting this presentation together, we were trying to figure out what to present and what not to present, because there's just a lot here. There are a lot of different industries that are affected by energy. You could look at this issue from a lot of different angles, and of course there are a lot of people that have. But we were trying to decide what would be the most critical. One of the things we wanted to do is talk a little bit about some of the data sources to help, if there's a particular part of this industry that we haven't had a chance to touch on here, you can go to textilemI.com, you can talk to us after the event, and we can try to do a deeper dive into this. And so some sources of data that I would encourage people to consider. Industry projections. Obviously, we have a projections team that goes and looks at the trend lines and say, let's project this line forward 10 years. And there's a combination of art and science. Because, for example, when they see a dramatic spike in a particular industry, sometimes that would tell you that the last 2 years might be a better predictor of future employment than the last 20. So they do try to use a little common sense there, but we come up with a set of industry and occupational projections. They're designed to err on the side of caution, but I think they're a helpful look at where things might be headed in the future. Staffing patterns. Staffing patterns, we have industry data which relates to what the company does. So an accountant that works for an oil firm would be in oil and gas in our industry data, but obviously their occupation would be accountant. Staffing patterns are like the bridge that takes you between industry and employment data. So a staffing pattern will tell you what is the proportion of occupations hired by a given industry, or what industries hire a given occupation. It allows you to connect the dots a little bit. Occupational projections is obviously the analog to industry projections, and there are certain occupations that are really key to any industry, including oil and gas, and that would be a very good thing to look at. The Comptroller of Public Accounts is braver in some ways than we are, because the Comptroller of Public Accounts actually tries to forecast a lot of things, including the price of oil. I believe that they forecast the price of oil, if I'm not mistaken. But there are usually once or twice a year, the Comptroller uploads a forecast that has a lot of different economic variables they forecast to the website. I do encourage people to consult that sometimes. And Help Wanted Online, which is advertised job openings. Now, there's a difference between the JOLTS data that Mike was talking about earlier and HWAL. HWAL is, I'm a business, I need help so badly that I'm willing to pay to take out an ad to let people know about my position. It is a subset of openings. JOLTS is a survey where we take a random sample of employers and say, how many openings do you have? How many people have you hired? That kind of thing. So JOLTS is an economy-wide. We try to catch all employers. HWAL is those that have chosen to take out an ad. But HWAL can sometimes tell you things about what's going on in the economy. So those are some sources. Now, obviously, I need to plug my own employer's product, TexasLMI.com. All of our data is posted at TexasLMI.com. We have tried to make it accessible. We've tried to make it easy to use. It is mobile friendly. All of our industry occupational staffing pattern data is available there. I would recommend the popular download section of the website. When you're dealing with projections data, it's a lot easier to download the spreadsheet and work with the data on the spreadsheet rather than doing a custom query, because we've put some spreadsheets up there that do a lot of the work for you with projections. Projections are available statewide and by workforce development area because it's funded to serve the workforce system. Now, I'll just take a look at some of the key industries and what we estimate in 2020 to 2030. We're expecting a 15% increase in oil and gas extraction. And as you can probably tell from the rest of this presentation, that's a little bit of a hard industry to forecast in because the price of oil, there are a lot of different factors that factor into the price of oil, and employment in this industry is highly correlated to what the price of oil is, so at a lag. So to some extent, there's a little bit of, it's a little more challenging to do a 10-year projection on oil and gas than others, but people need energy. I mean, it's what we would call a demand inelastic product. Support activities for mining, we see strong growth in that area. We see some growth, about 7.7% in petroleum and coal products manufacturing, which includes refineries. Chemical manufacturing, which, your petrochemical employment, 11.5% change. And then pipeline transportation, we see 18.7% change. And remember from the slides that Mike showed you, pipeline transportation is a much more steady trend line over time, a lot less cyclical than some of these other industries are, because in the end, there is a need to get petrochemicals from where it is produced and refined to where it could be used, which would be all over the country and all over the world. So that's kind of some of the key industries, how we see things from 2020 to 2030. One of the things we did is we took a look at what are the top occupations in NAICS 2111, which is oil and gas extraction, and you see accountants is at the top of the list. And that's why I say sometimes these staffing patterns, people forget that industries, all industries need accounting. There are occupations that you might not associate with an industry that are nonetheless hired in large quantities by an industry. And then the rest of them, petroleum engineers, I mean, that kind of makes sense. computer systems analysts, because we mentioned that productivity in oil and gas extraction has shot up in the last 10 years. Well, one way that, and Mike mentioned you're substituting capital for labor. One way that happens is you have IT staff, so you have some IT in this area. Wellhead pumpers would be obvious, secretaries, general operations managers you see just about everywhere, petroleum pump system operators, refinery operations engagers, roustabouts, oil and gas. So we use statewide staffing patterns to produce this chart. So if you're in an area that has a lot of oil and gas employment, this will tell you what jobs are hired and what percent of the industry, so that if you are advising somebody on what training they might want to get or where they're likely to find open positions, this staffing pattern data can give you a window into that area if is a industry that is big in your region. Also look at support activities for oil and gas, roustabouts, service unit operators, heavy and tractor trailer truck drivers, which is one of the most in-demand occupations just about everywhere and in a lot of industries, first line supervisors, rotary drill operators, derrick operators, general operation managers, and helpers, extraction workers. So that gives you an idea for that industry. And now I believe this is the petroleum and coal products manufacturing. And you see pump system operators and refinery operators, which kind of makes sense in the NAICS code that includes manufacturing. Chemical plant system operators, first line supervisors, chemical technicians, maintenance and repair workers, industrial machinery mechanics, heavy and tractor trailer truck drivers, and chemical engineers. Notice that in all of these lists I've read off, you have some occupations that have a variety of skill levels. So, not everybody is in a position where they're ready to undertake a 4-year degree, but there are jobs in these industries that are hiring that are at all of the different skill levels that we look at. And so these are some of the things you can do with staffing patterns to identify viable career paths for people who need them.
Excuse me, a quick question before we move on.
Sure.
In your JOLTS or whatever survey, do you take into account on the retiring population? In one particular example, I'm from Corpus Christi, so I know a lot of the conversations going on is about in the plants and the refineries, the retiring community that's, if COVID didn't make that decision for them about maybe it's time to move on, now it's the retirement phase. Is that taken into consideration in terms of information about big blocks of new opportunities there?
Not in the JOLTS data per se, but let me differentiate between JOLTS and projections. JOLTS is straight up survey of business that looks at how many job openings do you have. It would affect JOLTS in one way, and that's separations. So someone who retires would be listed in JOLTS as a leaver because they're leaving an occupation. But in terms of job openings and hirings, it's just straight up, they survey the businesses, how many job openings do you have? How many hires have you made during the reference period? And that wouldn't necessarily, and granted, there is a correlation between people leaving and hiring, but it's a straight up count of job openings and hires. Where it would show up in JOLTS would probably be that leaver category. It shows up indirectly because obviously if somebody leaves an occupation, you need to hire to replace them most of the time. So it would have an indirect relationship to JOLTS. It's probably not something that JOLTS measures real directly, except in that lever category. Now, projections produces an average annual openings category. And there are several ways you can have an opening in an occupation. One way you can have an opening is people leaving, which would include retirements, but not limited to retirements. Another one is what's called a transfer. So I was a technician, and I get promoted to be a manager. That would be a transfer. But my old position suddenly becomes open because I just got promoted. Now that's a good thing. You have a good worker, stays in the company, moves up. So there is basically levers. There's people who leave the profession. There is growth. We need more of this. And then there is transfers, and those are your three elements that make up openings. And so the projections program measures annual openings using data, And that would be influenced by retirement. Now, what you just described to me, I have heard anecdotally. I've heard a lot of concern, especially in the refinery industry, with the age of their workforce, and that a lot of their workforce is getting close to retirement. And one of the things we're looking at TWC is this whole middle skills job category, because there was a time in some parts of the state, and it varies, where we were pushing everybody for all the right reasons to go to college, because there is a correlation between educational attainment and labor market outcomes. But there are also good jobs in these middle skills categories. And I think in the last 10 years, certainly TWC has, we are paying a lot more attention to some of these middle skills jobs that people can get out of high school with an apprenticeship or with trade school that pay well, but don't necessarily require a four-year degree, because some people probably are such that a college is a really good fit for them. Others, they might want to go to college, but they may not be ready at age 18. People are different. And so the idea is create a workforce system that meets people where they are and leads them to good outcomes where they are. Now, it's easy for me to sit here and say that. It's probably a little harder to do that. But I think at least there's a realization, and this is just my own observation, personal observation from being in it for a little while, that these kinds of pathways are important. But I have heard anecdotally a lot of what you've been hearing in the industry, which is there is concern about the average age of the workforce and retirements and how are they going to replace the retiring workers. We have data that addresses it, but maybe not quite as directly as you stated in your question. Okay, and now the other thing I mentioned, the comptroller forecast, and they do forecast price of oil and future employment. Like I said, if you're trying to forecast the price of oil, you're either very brave, or if you do it well, you probably make a lot of money. Obviously, since a comptroller works for the public, that's not their concern, but I'm saying if you could forecast the price of oil with complete accuracy, whoever does that probably is doing very well. Okay, I've told 2 or 3 bad jokes in the morning. I'll try to spare you the rest. H-wall. Oops, let's see. Did I skip over slides here? Here we go. Yeah, H-wall. We have placed some rudimentary H-wall information on the LMI website from a contractor we have. It is very basic, number of job openings by region. It isn't something that's easily slice and diceable, but it is public. Almost every workforce board I'm aware of has access to the Lightcast, which I believe is a contract TWC has, or it may be a national contract, but has access to Lightcast, which is much more detailed and much more customizable H-wall information. So for those of you who work for workforce boards, which is probably the vast majority of you, your board should have access to some very detailed H-wall data. Check around at your place of employment to see who is the person who has the account. For those who are not affiliated with the workforce board, there are several third-party providers that offer the service. Obviously, as a state agency, we aren't picking winners and losers here, but there are several third-party providers that we're aware of that do parse H-wall information, but it can be useful. Here's job ads in mining, quarrying, and oil and gas extraction from 2019 to the present. And you can see some peaks and valleys here. You obviously could see 2020 was quite a big dip, no surprise there. But even recently, even in the last 6 months or so, it's been a little bit of a roller coaster. And that's why when I started my remarks, I mentioned that there is some question. What does the future hold? It's hard for me to sit here with a crystal ball and give you a perfect answer to that question, because the productivity data, the workplace injury data, and all the other data we've been looking at say that this industry is changing, but we don't really completely know how yet. So I think it's going to be an interesting few years. If you look at the want ads, heavy tractor trailer truck drivers is at the top of the list, but it's at the top of the list for a lot of things. That is a job that is in intense demand. It and nursing will show up in almost any H-wall list you pull. Maintenance and repair workers, managers, production workers, accountants and auditors, and sales representatives. One of the things we did is we looked at the pie chart for want ads, and Houston obviously does real well in this. It does kind of track it's kind of nice when your data works out that way. It does kind of track the job pie chart I showed earlier. Houston is a little bit higher. It's at 39%, which is a little higher than the job count. Midland almost tracks it exactly, as does Odessa. So this pie chart is very similar to the other pie chart that I showed in terms of the geographic distribution of oil and gas employment. So, I know we covered a lot of material in a relatively short period of time, but we figured this is an industry that is very important to Texas, and is frankly very important to the nation of the world, because energy prices do play a significant role in the national economy, and energy employment does. And we thought it would be good, just given how critical this industry can be to some important regions of our state, that we spend a little bit of time talking about this industry, because in a lot of these forums we've done general economic overview, which is important. It's important to give people an idea where the economy is kind of from the big 50,000 foot level, but we were also trying to do something a little different in the forum and try to focus on a part of the economy and do a little bit more in depth. So I hope this has been successful. I thank you for coming. Both of us thank you for coming, because I know that data early in the morning, I hope we've managed to keep you all awake today. With that, I think we have about 10 minutes left, if I'm not mistaken, before time. So if there are questions, I'm sure Mike and I can take up to about 10 minutes of questions, and then we'll let you, am I right, 9:45 is the stop time?
Yes, we've got about 10 minutes.
Then we can let you go for the break. So if there are questions, I know I'd be happy to take questions. I hope I'll have some decent answers. Yes?
Good morning. Any insights on how the Orphan Well project is going to impact future jobs in the oil field? I mean, there's millions of money coming in, so I don't know if there's any insights as to how that's going to maybe create more jobs in the oil and gas industry.
I mean, Mike, do you have anything on that?
I'm not aware of, you said the orphan?
Right, the Orphan Well project. So there's a lot of wells that once they stop producing, they just remain there, and they are letting out fumes and gases, and so there's some agencies that are trying to get the Railroad Commission to plug those up, and there is that bureaucracy of the Railroad Commission, and there's already like $82 million that have been of grant money that has been funded to the Railroad Commission to work on plugging those orphan wells.
I'd have to look more carefully at data for that in the future, because one question we'd have to look at is what industry would that data be classified in? In other words, the company that does that work, if they get the grant, would they be like support activities, or would they be in some other industry codes? So the first thing we'd have to do is locate the correct I'd have to go back and do some research on what industry those workers would be classified in. And the other question is the size of that grant big enough to move the needle? Because you're saying right now there's still some uncertainty about whether that project moves forward. And the question is that grant amount big enough to move the employment needle on a statewide basis? And those are the questions that I would ask just off the top of my head. But it's a very interesting topic, because a lot of things have changed in the industry in the last 20 years. And so I think it's a really good issue you're raising. Are there other questions we could have? Okay.
In terms of number of rig counts, I think the last one you said was 370 as of current.
Mm-hmm.
What was the peak in order to give comparison at the highest number of rigs that were out in the marketplace?
I'd have to go back and actually look at that, but if I have your contact information, I can send it to you. We do have that data on our files. Off the top of my head, I can't remember. That was not the peak though. That's it was higher than that, the 370.
If you were to take a guess, just so I can put it in perspective, are we talking about 1,000 maybe at the highest peak, 800? I mean, I'm not looking for an exact number, just to try to get a sense of where has this gone over time, because as production improves and efficiencies in technology, you're going to see less and less rigs out there. Does that then equate to less future employment opportunities, or is it just a standstill situation right now that until the next peak comes that you'll see it again? That would be interesting to understand as well.
Are good questions. I just put the graph up, the slide up that Mike gave, and if you notice, in Feb 2019, because we downloaded the last 4 years of data in the slide, in Feb of 19, it was a little over 500. So it was higher. The rig count was higher in 19 than it was in than it is now. Oops, I accidentally advanced the slide. Apologize for that. There we go. So you see, it was higher in 19. We still haven't gotten rig count-wise back to where we were prior to the 2020 period, because you see that red curve there. I may go into the slide and see if we downloaded additional months in the back end of the slide, because sometimes we put a little more data in there than we display on the chart. But once we get back to our office, give Mike and I your contact information. We can look it up and probably give you a much more a fuller time series on that issue. You're welcome. Are there other questions we can answer or try to answer? Well, thank you for your interest, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you all so much. Just one more quick reminder, don't forget to get your parking validated at the front desk. And if you are at the hotel, please make sure to check out before noon. Thank you.